To understand classics, and for that matter, any book, any theatre production, any film, the key to it are the meta-stories. And by meta-stories, what we're talking about is the fundamental story structures that are embellished to produce a novel. There are a handful of examples of these meta-stories. Beauty and the Beast, for example, represents a meta-story. Anyone who enjoys reading modern romance, or any romance novels, you will tend to see this taming of the male character by the female. Mr. Darcy, for example, is tamed in Pride and Prejudice. Taming in modern romance more takes the form of the man becoming more communicative, emotionally vulnerable. But fundamentally, the story is the same. It's the same Beauty and the Beast story, where the man is fundamentally changing due to the influence of the female character. And of course, we also see the subversion of that. The story of St. George is another meta-story. Lives in a protected environment, a walled city, goes out, kills the dragon, rescues the maiden, takes the treasure, returns home. Fundamentally, the same story as the Hobbit. Leaves the comfort of his home, goes out, literally slays the dragon, literally takes the treasure, and returns home, more developed and better as a person. And a fine example would be the hero's journey. So the heights that the hero is at the start of the journey, the fall, and then the subsequent rise to even greater heights. Pinocchio is an example of this as well. You see that Pinocchio starts off as an animated puppet, a height, more than a puppet should be, falls as he gets entrapped and goes to Pleasure Island, and then rises again as he saves his father, and becomes a real boy, rising to heights higher than what he was originally. So those are perhaps the three best examples of meta-stories. But the one that I'd like to talk about today is Cain and Abel, one of the biblical stories. And you'll notice that a lot of these stories are very archaic. They're either old fairy tales, legends, or in this case, biblical stories. And perhaps the reason that these have become the meta-stories is that they were prolonged by an oral tradition. And when you are telling stories, it tends to be that you only remember the key parts, and those are the aspects that you emphasize. So over time, as the story is told more and more, it is boiled down to the fundamental truths that the story withholds. Whereas in the written tradition, we see much more embellishment. Stories can go on much longer. Although if we look at Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, we do see the extent that an oral tradition can take, and how it almost becomes a form of song or verse when it reaches that length. But more typically, the archaic stories are short, to the point, and that's why often the meta-stories are found within them. So why is Cain and Abel important? Why do we care? In terms of classics, we see it frequently. We see it in John Steinbeck's East of Eden, Ken Kesey's Sometimes Great Notion, very overtly. We see it perhaps more subtly in Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. We see it in the character of Anatole in Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. We see it in the film Gladiator. We even see it in the film Ratatouille. In TV, Breaking Bad, fundamentally, is a Cain and Abel story at its heart. Game of Thrones, while a book and a TV show, was predicated on the notion of Cain and Abel. And if we turn to real life, we can see it within the events of the 20th century. Within Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, there are the hallmarks of a Cain and Abel relationship and a Cain and Abel mentality that led to the atrocities that it did. And as is so often the case with these sorts of stories, they act as a warning of where certain sentiments can lead. But what are those sentiments? What is the story of Cain and Abel? Cain and Abel really are the first humans. They are the two children of Adam and Eve. And while Cain worked the land, Abel raised animals. And both of them gave the fruits of their labour as offerings to God. And God took favour with Abel. But he gave no regard to Cain. And that bothered Cain. Because why was he not getting the same regard that Abel was? They were giving the same offerings, the produce that they worked so hard to produce. And yet Abel got all of God's praise, thanks, and love, and Cain seemingly got nothing. So he went to God. So what's going on? Why am I not getting the regard that I feel that I'm due? And depending on the translation that you look at, or the version of the Bible, God can say some different things. In some, God says to Cain, if you do well, then you'll be rewarded. If not, you'll find sin. But it is your job to master that sin. In some versions, he says to Cain, sin has knocked at your door, and you have welcomed it in. It has nothing to do with the offerings that you have given me. It is the fact that you have welcomed sin in and united with it. So those two vary in the harshness of God, although it's important to remember that the God in the Old Testament was cruel. He was not a nice God, and really not something that humans would want to emulate. So Cain left, not too satisfied with the answer that had been given by God, and he went and called his brother Abel into the field, at which point he murdered him. God then comes to find Abel. He sees Cain instead and asks, where is Abel? Cain tells him he doesn't know. But God says that he knows what's happened. He can hear the blood of Cain calling to him from the soil. And as punishment to Cain, the earth will no longer yield to him, and he is forced to become a fugitive and a wanderer of the earth. And what's more than that, If anyone takes vengeance upon Cain, they will have the same vengeance returned to them, but sevenfold. Which is an interesting little caveat that God throws in. But what does it all mean? Well, fundamentally, we can see that jealousy is at the heart of it. Cain feels that he isn't getting what he deserves. He feels that life is unfair and that he deserves more. And he targets Abel as the object of his jealousy. Abel is getting what he wants. And so that is the direction that Cain's jealousy is targeted towards. And in the classics, we often see that this manifests quite concretely. Raskolnikov has an individual who is the object of his jealousy and who takes his vengeance upon. In Frankenstein, we see it manifest very concretely as well, with the creation, although jealous of humanity as a whole, or specifically targeting and taking it out on Victor Frankenstein. And we can see it even more concretely in East of Eden and sometimes Great Notion, which fundamentally are expansions of the Cain and Abel story. They take two brothers, one who is jealous of the other, and returns to exact vengeance upon them. However, we can also see this manifest in a more abstract manner. For example, if we look at Breaking Bad, and Walter White taking the figure of Cain. He feels that he doesn't have what he is due. And while we can, to an extent, manifest that in the two business partners that he had, who feel robbed him, he's more taken out on society as a whole. And that's why he breaks bad and pursues the route that he does. He feels he was more deserving, and so to get what is owed to him, there is nothing that he will not do, and the world must suffer at his hands. And so we can quickly see how the Cain and Abel story bridges quite neatly into nihilism. And really it's because there is no justification given as to why Cain's sacrifices are no more worthy than Abel's. There is no reason. There is no accurate allocation of value. It's just God has decided that Cain is not worthy. Perhaps there is an illusion that he is sinning in the rest of his life. So unless the rest of his life is perfect, these offerings do not matter at all. They don't compensate for all else that he has done. So any character that is nihilistic, that feels that there is no meaning to life, life is pointless, and then they try and take it out upon the world, and cause havoc in that manner, is arguably a Cain-like figure. So there are three components really to understand from the Cain and Abel story. The first is the jealousy. The second is the anger that was produced by Cain feeling that he was not getting what he deserved. And the third is the format that the revenge took place. The revenge in and of itself is significant. The pathway from jealousy to revenge. But the manner in which Cain exacted his revenge is even more interesting, because God was the one who was denying him. But he didn't take it out on God. He took it out on the person who he thought was getting what he deserved. So Cain hurt God by hurting Abel. And then the other component of the revenge is the fact that anyone who takes vengeance on Cain will receive it back sevenfold. And really here we're alluding to the escalation of vengeance. And it's the same sort of mobster mentality. If you send one of our guys to the hospital, we're going to send one of your guys to the morgue. And so even there, you see this Cain and Abel story. And it may raise the question that if this story is so prevalent, then what's the significance of Cain and Abel in the first place? And one, the prevalence of the story is what makes Cain and Abel so significant. Because while it might not be the first story that was told with this narrative, it's certainly one of the earliest that we have in the written tradition. The story of Cain and Abel is at least 2 millennia old, and probably predates that by centuries, as it was passed along through the oral tradition. Stories in the written tradition are really very recent. If we look at the history of human creativity, and if we include art and still images, then the history of human storytelling is tens of thousands of years old. And there is no reason why we shouldn't include still images in storytelling. Films, after all, are just a collection of still images. So in the first instance, it's the age of this story that gives it so much weight. But secondly, it's the brevity of it. It's a very concise story. It's at most 500 words, and yet all of these other stories have spawned from it. So, you've got the meta story, and now you're reading something else. How does this help you understand it? I suppose in the one fact, it's about recognizing these two characters, or how they can manifest. Recognizing the character who is hard done by, who is not getting what they deserve, who is nihilistic because of that fact, who is angry and who is jealous. And then we can see their motivations and the path that they will likely take, the vengeance that they will wreak. We can also recognize Abel, the character who is innocent, naive. They do not understand what they're doing. There's no malicious intent in it. And yet for some reason, they are unfairly rewarded. And they are the target and the person who suffers as a result of the jealousy from the Cain character. And then we have the character of God, who is corrupt, seemingly no logic to his actions, and so represents the unjust authority who is taking it out on the subordinates. And this doesn't have to be confined to individual characters. The character of Abel in particular can be applied to groups as a whole. A Cain character can look at the Abels and say, they are getting what I deserve. I should be where they are. I should be having what they have, and so take revenge and anger upon them. So it's the ability to recognize these characters, to recognize the story structure, what's going on. From there, we can understand intentions. We can understand what motivates the character, what do they want, where the story is going. And the better we can predict where a story is going, the better that we can understand it. Because the depth from a story is really from rereading it. At a first pass, it's hard to glean anything from a story, or any real depth from it. However, if we already know the story, if we already know what structure it's going to take, if we can already recognize the characters that are present in it, then we can understand more. You may ask yourself how people can read a book at the first time of asking and come out with so much from it. And this is why. And it might not be from these meta stories, but just reading stories like that. So I've just finished reading The Monte Cristo at the time of filming. And it's very evident, and perhaps part of the motivation for making this video, that it's a Cain and Abel story. And we have it at many different layers throughout it, and repeated it multiple times. We have the initial Cain and Abel story in the introduction to the book, and then really the rest of the book represents Cain and Abel's story as well. There's also a lot of Shakespearean elements in it as well. So from reading that, from also reading other literature at that time, from 19th century France, from knowing about the history, the Napoleonic period, reading the Count of Monte Cristo becomes very easy, because nothing in it is really novel, except perhaps for the place names and the character names. And it doesn't make it boring, because it can still be read purely for the enjoyment of the story, as opposed to an over literary analysis every single time. But it just makes it a lot easier to understand what's going on. It doesn't make it difficult to read a story. Understanding the meta stories means any classic that you pick up will be easy. There is nothing difficult about it, because you know the story. You've read it 100 times, and you understand it because you've read it in these very short formats, which are much simpler to understand. So I would urge you, if you want to have a good understanding of the classics, or of any book or any story, to read meta stories, to find out what they are, to understand them, and then you will see that they appear time and again in books. And the books that are successful are often the ones which stick truly to the meta stories, because they do hold fundamental truths. As I said, it's not just in film, TV and literature that we see these meta stories. We saw them play out in the 20th century, and it plays out in our own lives too. Jealousy is real, and not just because we want to be like someone else, but often because we look at someone and we say, they don't deserve that. I deserve what they have. I'm much better than them. I work much harder than them. And so this is a warning for us. What are you going to do with that feeling? What are you going to do with your feeling of jealousy? Are you going to master that sin? Or are you going to let it take control of you and follow the path that Cain did, to murder his own brother? But all that he did that for was to spite God. His brother, fundamentally, hadn't done anything wrong. So even beyond just understanding stories, for understanding ourselves and the events that go on in the world, these meta stories are vitally important. They've resonated and existed for thousands of years because they speak fundamental human truths. They talk about the human condition and who we are, and they give a warning to us. What path do we want to follow? And given the opportunity, will we be able to master our vices? That's the story of Cain and Abel. That's how to understand most of classic literature. And I'll see you in the next one.